Thanks a lot. It's a bit hard condensing 18 years worth of research into about 10-15 minute talk. So a lot of the stuff will literally just be glancing over. So please feel free to contact me afterwards if you want any specific on any specific aspects. A lot of it will just be sort of, like I said, touched on just to give you an indication of what we've done. And essentially, yes, somebody said to me, oh, Esperance, it's almost part of South Australia, it's just on the wrong side of the Nullarbor. And I think that's very true because what we've got there, we've got the same sort of climate, we've got the same environment, we share the same biota and everything else, so it is very similar, and hence the fact that I thought it would be relevant to just indicate to you what we'll be doing out there. Just the presentation overview. I'll be discussing the background, why the problem was there and what we perceived, the solutions to be in a number of years, 2003, 2007, 2011, 2013, 2015. That's just as things worked out and how we did reviews. And then, of course, the way forward. So the Lake Warden catchment background, it's 212,000 hectares of the catchment with direct runoff to Lake Warden is only about 5,800 hectares. You see there's a vast contrast there in when you talk about sub-catchments as compared to the entire side of the catchment. 75% of the catchment is cleared for annuals, and only about 15% of our native vegetation still survives in the catchment itself. Main uses, of course, is agroforestry, cropping, beef and sheep farming. And then the Lake Warden wetland system has been a Ramsar site since 1990. And it was recognised under the state salinity strategy in 1996 that there's a big problem and that the lake system was degrading rapidly and that something needed to be done. The program at the time was destined to run until 2030, but as a result of huge financial difficulties of the Western Australian government, the project got canned in August 2014 prematurely. So basically that's what it is. As you can see, massive land clearing. You can also see the extensive lake systems, all basically interdunal systems if you want to look at them for a lack of a better term, and then feeding into it. And three major catchments, and we've sort of broken it up and saying, well, that's the western suite, that would be the central suite, and then we have the eastern suite on the other side. And these systems work either together or separately depending on how wet it is through the year. So some of the Lake Warden wetland system values that we've got, biological values, obviously the migratory water birds and the macro corridor linkages to the existing biota that's still left. Water quality ecosystem functions, infrastructure protection. The lake system itself is basically surrounds the town of Esperance. So without that lake system to absorb floods, the town is basically underwater. And then, of course, Indigenous European heritage, and very important for recreation and tourism. We've also got educational values. There's a student curriculum package called the Kipwari package. That's available where the guys actually go in, they do anything from aquatic invertebrate sampling and analysis under microscopes to just large-scale work. And then, of course, aesthetic landscape values. People pay $300,000-400,000 for a small block of land overlooking the lakes. So obviously land's a bit more valuable. Now, the asset management objectives changed over the years, but the final one when the project ended was basically to recover and maintain the biological species and communities within the Lake Warden system, to deliver knowledge, educational, personal amenity, recreation and spiritual and philosophical values. It's a mouthful. Basically what we've done is we've went through a series of workshops over the years, and the objective was changed based on what the community wanted. So we were not just managing the system for the sake of conservation, we were managing it for a specific set of values and prioritised by the community in terms of what they wanted. And that changed over the years, as you can expect. 10 years ago, when the lead incident was there, the whole idea of the actual safety or water birds as a primary indicator of system health was very important. That sort of dropped by the wayside as things changed over the years. We've also established then that hydrological threats, specifically water quality and quantity, pose the greatest risk to achieving those ASIS objectives. So why? Well, basically, you can look at the little thingy at the top and you'll understand what happens there. But statistically, we had 3 in 100-year flood events in less than a decade. And you can see by looking at the photographs what the damage did to the town and what happened to it. This is the Banning Creek Harbour. That's all sand. They had to basically drench the whole harbour to get all the sand out, and a massive, massive damage to the town itself. And part of the problem was that once that water got into the system, couldn't get back out of the system. It was just stuck there. So even the smallest rainfall event with a bit of runoff and the lake system will be back up again, town will be flooded, and just constantly, just never got an opportunity to actually dry out. So in 2003 to 2007, that was when we first sort of, how big is this problem that we've got? We've developed an optimal waterbird habitat model, the Lake Warden water balance model, and a catchment water use model. And from that, we then established that, and with some Bayesian belief network probability modeling, that if we were to replant the catchment, we only had a 3.8% to a 2 to 9% chance of actually recovering the vegetation as well as the shorebirds, or specifically for the system. So even if we planted up the whole catchment, we're talking about it'll just take too long. The system's not going to recover. So the only viable option we could really find was if we actually went down to engineering works, because then we had a probability of about 60 to 70% to recover the fringing vegetation and almost 80% of all the shorebirds specifically. So from the water balance, we then said, well, we need to basically drain from the Lake Wheatfield system about 2.4 gigalitres per year, and from Lake Warden 0.5 to 2 gigalitres per year. If we can get that water out of the system, we'll recover it and get it back to ideal water levels that we needed to do. So they did some feasibility studies, engineering, looked at different alternatives. You can see different pipelines going through. As part of that, we did some, again, probability modelling to see which one's going to give us the highest success rates, the highest returns, weigh that up against all your environmental factors. And at the end of the day, there was a bunch of stuff we did. This is the Banning Creek Weir, which basically stopped water from the eastern sweep exiting into the ocean. And then when the eastern sweep floods, it overflows into the central and the western sweep. So taking that out, water goes out to the sea. Putting a pipeline into Lake Wheatfield so that we can actually drain the central sweep. Targeted revegetation and fencing so that we can fix the thing. And then also certain key points in the catchment where water, again, got clogged up behind roads and things like that, and then backflowed into the lake systems. We fixed those up. So a number of things were done, and which changed the hydrology of the system to a large degree. And when I'm saying change, I don't mean that in a negative way. We should really use the word restore. Because of the infrastructure that constructed over the years, that actually changed. And we just tried to reinstate the original hydrology of the system. But there are certain things, like there's a canal system that bypasses the lake system. That's obviously artificial. We've got the pipeline running through there. So it changed the whole hydrology of the system. And where the system, being flooded, worked as a single unit with a 212,000 hectare catchment, we ended up with 3 distinct hydrological suites again that operated independently of each other. And just as an indication, the blue line is Lake Wheatfield, the red line is Lake Warden. Now Lake Warden this is AHD on the side, and you can see that when we started implementing the Lake Wheatfield pipeline, there was a clear separation of the hydrographs, which indicates the central suite versus the western suite and how they operated. So basically we moved from a system that's being flooded, and we managed to get it back into a system that sort of operated independently of each other, which led to recovery of shorebirds, stabilization of the embankments, massive recruitment of our vegetation, recovery of dead melaleucas on the fringing vegetation. So, and wow, the shorebirds came back, as you can see. This was in the 80s, that's where the system was flooded, and the massive increase. Which, again, looking at then a bit longer, Lake Warden, this is the optimal water depth, and you can see that where there it went up, and then we got it back down again, operating within the optimal area. But then you start asking yourself, well, we fixed the problem with the hydrology. Is that enough? Have we done enough? And we had to look at various things, and we said, well, let's look at the water balance. Let's look at the water movement through the system again, the aquatic biomass, how much water birds can we do, nutrient balance, etc. And from the 2011 gap analysis, we said, okay, we'll be looking at the water balance, salt and nutrient balance, and specifically aquatic invertebrates. When we looked at the water birds, we saw that based on historic data, the optimum or the highest abundance and the highest species diversity is when the lake levels are between 0.4 and 1.5 meters. However, after the lake levels started dropping, specifically in Lake Warden, we saw a massive increase in salinity as compared to the old one, meaning that there's now salts in the system that wasn't there before, and that was affecting our ranges. And what we then saw was that as soon as the salinity goes above 160, basically all the shorebirds disappear completely from the lake system itself. So even though we got it back to operating within the optimum water levels, salinity was a large problem. We then looked at various models, and we said, okay, what can we do about it? We looked at the historic data and things like that. We came up with a couple of hypotheses in terms of different threshold values, specifically for salinity. And we did some modeling and said, well, okay, if we're going to start operating and we have to run the lake deeper, what would that actually mean? How much would we reduce the shorebird habitat? But what's the point in having 80 hectares of shorebird habitat when there's nothing for the birds to eat because the salinity is too high? So that's sort of trade-offs that we had to look at. And in 2013, we basically came to the conclusion that we really had to redo the water balance. Specifically, and look at those things in more detail. From that, we expanded our hydrological monitoring, and at the time of closure, we had 70 bores that we read monthly, 6 floating evaporation pans, 19 surface water sites that we measured fortnightly, which is done for nutrients as well as just basic water quantity. And it also, we back to some modelling for specifically Bayesian belief probability analysis, and we came to the conclusion that there's no win-win scenarios, but everything's a trade-off. There's nothing you can do that fixes everything. It's a cause and effect. If you fix one thing, the other one goes down. Then we did the Pink Lake study, because part of it, Pink Lake was never included as part of the Lake Warden wetland system. So we did the Pink Lake study. And that included various lakes around Pink Lakes, and if anybody's interested in this data, there seems to be quite an interest in Pink Lakes all of a sudden. But that data is available, and Pink Lakes are not uncommon, they're not rare, they're not anything like that. And we did find that, contrary to some belief, that in fact it is Duniella salina that actually causes the Pink Lakes to be pink. And this is a take-home message. I'm going to leave it at this, but this is a take-home message. And one of the most important things, and I think that South Australia very relevant to. When people talk about the salinity, they measure it in conductivity and they relate it back to milligrams per litre or parts per million. But that is what your equation line looks like, whereas this is the actual measured TDS values. So as soon as you have TDS values that goes above 160 millisiemens per centimetre, you cannot use that value and put it into an equation and expect the reporting on the thing. In fact, the error can be as much as 50 to 60%. So why are Pink Lakes pink? Abiotic factors all clumped together. And the way forward. So what have we got? At the end of the day, I think we've reached our objectives, but at the end of the day, I guess the final straw would be for us to get the salts out of Lake Warden, get it back into Pink Lake. Pink Lake will go pink again. Lake Warden won't be pink again. We'll have the shorebird back. So, special thanks to everybody that's been working on the project, and there's a list of references if anybody wants any of the papers. A lot of the stuff's available. Like I say, it's about 18 years worth of data. So.
Excellent.